interesting encounter. We were having the Black Lives Matter march here in Percival, and as I was saying last week, as I'm walking down the main street in Percival here in the parade, I see a group of people kind of starting to bunch up just past Hatcher Street on Main Street. And when I get there, I see what the issue is, that there are people who are in the Percival gun shop who are brandishing their guns, standing right next to the march. And as I look over, as I pass, I see Phyllis and Cindy with their arms out, waving people forward. Their backs to the people who had guns. I did understand that later that they didn't have any clips in, so it wasn't as if they were going to shoot anybody, but the threat of it certainly was there, and the sense of trying to intimidate was also there. But these two women, as well as I know Buta Biberai, were there and were just so helpful to keep the marchers separated from the people at the gun shop in ways that we wouldn't get into something that was unhelpful and on the edge of violence. There was kind of it was not just a moment where the two of them actually kind of met each other and I know started a relationship of respect and I hope mutual communication. But it was also kind of a neat thing just to see that moment with so much division over black and blue in some sense. Here were somebody from the police force, a political leader of our public life, and the public all together, united with a sense of purpose for community good. And that's really, I think, what's asked for in all the kinds of things that are going on, a sense where the public, the police, those who are our leaders can have a sense of gathering so that they, bring out the best of who we are. It's kind of a matter of trust in a certain sense as I think about it. And I'm going to ask them to have a dialogue with each other. And I want to start kind of with that trust question. I think, a great deal of what's needed in our nation, and I know we're just a small microcosm of the nation. We perhaps don't have the same kinds of issues ourselves that we see happening in other places. But there is a sense of a brokenness of trust. And that's what's not able to be addressed, or what people are asking could be addressed. And I don't want to just look at the deficit of trust, but I also want to say, what would it look like if we were able, like in that moment in the parade, to find ways that we can see trust fulfilled? So, Phyllis, Chair Randall, I'm going to start with you and ask you maybe if you could comment a little bit about that kind of question about where trust might come, and especially, with regard to, as a political leader, how you might see that taking place in ways that the police, the law enforcement officials kind of are able to maybe have some changes that would help engender that trust in others.
Well, first, Pastor David and St. Andrews, thank you for having me here. When I was asked to do this, I thought, what a great opportunity. I am by profession, before I became the chair of the county, I'm a mental health therapist. And so I always believe in conversations. Conversations, talking works. And I believe in having courageous conversations that are not always comfortable, but that are always important. So thank you for having me. First of all, I would gently push back that there is a lack of trust between black and blue. I would say that there is a lack of trust between minority communities and any law enforcement who is working outside the bounds of what many in the minority community might think is fair and just and right and in fact abusive. So it's not between black and blue. It is between people who believe that law enforcement is important, law enforcement is valuable, law enforcement is necessary, but also believe that law enforcement should be accountable and should not be, quite frankly, abusive. That is the divide. And I would also, with respect, gently push back that this started for the African American community with George Floyd. It did not. George Floyd happened to be what was caught on tape for almost 9 minutes, and so it was jarring to the country. But African Americans have been talking about this not just for years, but quite frankly for generations, and the issues that come along with this. And as I think it was Will Smith that first said, this is not new, it is just now being taped, it's just now being recorded, because of course everyone is walking around with cell phones. I am gratified that that the country has now looked up and said, this is a problem, and what do we do? And we're in the middle of the what do we do phase. And the what do we do phase always doesn't look comfortable. It looks confusing, it looks a little bit chaotic. But after the what do we do phase will come what's next. And that's what I'm so happy to be sitting here with Chief McAlister to talk about, which is the what's next phase. And I think that if there is a police chief in the country, because I don't think Loudon's different in the country, who is already doing it right, it is Cynthia McAlister. When we had the BLM, the Black Lives Matters First Amendment march, she was there. She was part of it. She lent her police force to it. She spoke. And I think that's exactly how you start to build the trust that needs to happen, is that, I believe that the vast majority of law enforcement who gets up every morning and puts that uniform on and does it without a lot of pay, does it because what is on the side of their car, because they want to protect and serve. And so when someone in law enforcement steps outside of those boundaries and does something that is not okay and not right, the most important voices to step up is the voices of law enforcement to say, that is not okay, that is not who we are, that is not representing us, and that is not protecting and serving. And the fact that Chief McAlister did that at that march that day and continues to do it, I believe that is what builds the trust. People who feel abused can say all day long, we feel abused and we feel that's not right, and we should. But it is when the other voices come and join us in that and say, you know what, it's not right, that it becomes more powerful. I'll say one last thing and then I'll stop. There's never been a time in American history where African Americans haven't been joined by our white brethren and sisters who are on our side, that we didn't move forward. During slavery, we needed the abolitionist movement. During the civil rights movement, we needed the freedom fighters who didn't look like us. And when we had them join us, it made the movement all that more powerful. And so it's not us against them. It's everyone who believes in right and righteousness and justice and peace against those who would stoke fear and would encourage both with a clear message or with a meta message, that what we sometimes see out of some law enforcement, in fact, few law enforcement, is not okay.
Cynthia, I know, Chief McAlister, I'm sorry. I know that when I talked to you, you said that there's like 8 different kinds of things that people asked for to be a part of policing, like no chokeholds and the like. And I don't know all those 8 things, so you might be able to articulate. But how do you see yourself and the Purcellville Police Department trying to address some of those kinds of issues, and where do you feel challenges about that?
I think that in law enforcement, especially I must say in the Northern Virginia area, we're very, very fortunate to have very good training. And I think we pay attention to situations that happen in our country and say, what could we have done better? And I think every time we see an incident that comes across the news, the law enforcement leaders should look at that and say, okay, what went wrong, what was done right, and what is the whole story. I think a lot of times we see it and we jump to conclusion, and I'm not saying the things that we've seen are right, but what led that situation to that point? So let's dissect it and figure out where that is. And is it in the people we hire? Is it in the culture? Is it in the training that we provide? What are the circumstances? Because the things that we see on TV are horrific to us as well. Just like Phyllis said, it's 99% of us put on a uniform and never in a million years expect something to happen as the situations we've seen on the media lately. Most everyone in a uniform is there for the good of the community that they serve. So we have to look, I think, at what can we do better? How can we bring people to the table? How can we get people to understand what we do and why we do it? How can we reach out to the community and say, what do you want your police department to do for you? We certainly know safe neighborhoods and the not having fear of crime are things that people are looking for in their community, and that's what draws people to certain communities. But every community in this United States, in this world, deserves a community where they can raise their children, they can live, and they don't have to worry about being victims of crime. And that's our position. We really are out there as the guardians of the community, and we train that way. But what goes awry and what puts the officers and the suspect or the person involved in the situation that escalates it to a deadly situation? So I think looking back, and the 8 can't wait, we've looked at those, and we can say, I can tell you, we don't train chokeholds, carotid holds, and we haven't. But what we do want people to know, we do want officers to know what it is in case it's ever used on them, so they know what's coming. Over the last few decades, I guess it is, we've had different types of martial arts come and the training that people get and the hobbies that people have, so we want the officers to know what that is. When it comes to unbiased, complete investigations of situations officers are involved in, the community deserves those, and we as a profession deserve those, that we do find out what went wrong, and if anything went wrong, and if the officer did step out of bounds, that they're held accountable for it. And we owe telling the community the details of what happened. Nothing should be a mystery about how we operate. Our general orders, our policies should all be open. That's our playbook. The Constitution's our playbook. And people should know where our guidelines are. So I think, looking at training and do we get enough training? It's expensive to train. People that have hobbies, if you're not practicing your hobby, you get rusty at it. People step away from their hobbies sometimes when they, get married and start working and have families, and then they want to get back in their hobbies, and it comes back eventually. But so you take officers that are in critical situations, and even firearms training, defensive tactics training, if we don't practice that continually when it comes to the time on the street that we need it, are we rusty? Or is it incumbent on us on our own time to practice it? But on our own time, life also gets in the way. So I think, we do have to come together. We do have to sit at the table. And I'm looking forward to those uncomfortable, crucial conversations that we have to have, because they're not going to be comfortable all the time. I have 2 kids, 23 and 21, and we have uncomfortable conversations sometimes. But I love hearing from them, because the group of people right now standing with the African American community is a lot of our young, educated kids, I want to call them, but they're not. They're young adults. They're taking over when we're stepping off into retirement. And they are creating an atmosphere that I think will set them at the table and have those conversations, probably far easier than folks my age. But folks our age, my age, have to be in those conversations. I think the energy, the inclusiveness that you see in the younger generation, but yet the wisdom and experience of the older middle generations need to come together and sit at the table.
Now, I know in talking to Chief McAlister, and I said I've enjoyed our conversation together. I feel fortunate that you've been able to spend time with me and talking. We've talked about the Citizens Advisory Board that was been proposed in the town of Purcellville, and about things that might be helpful for that Citizens Advisory Board. including, as you were telling me, if people are going to be on it, rather than just being without an understanding of what police work is like, to have them go in some drive-alongs and to have some kind of orientation and training as well. But I know, as we've talked, I've learned a lot about the Purcellville Police Department. We're a small community compared to so many others, and so one of the challenges is, like you were just saying, that sense of, how do you keep from getting rusty or forgetting things, because there are not that many situations that our police officers here are dealing with. Yet because we're so small, one of the wonderful things that you said to me, and I hope it's all right if I share this with everybody, but you said you went to set the policies for the police department as the new chief one time, and you looked around in the room where it happens, and you were the only one in there. And so you said, I wish there was some kind of partnership with me. Now, I know you also come from the Fairfax Police Department in Fairfax County, and so you do know of a larger police system. But tell us, maybe all of us, a little bit about what kinds of things might be helpful for that kind of system of, some kind of accountability for the Purcellville Police Department, but maybe if you could reflect also on how that might be beneficial for a larger kind of police force as well.
I think it's important for the citizens to understand why we do what we do. I think they should understand what, just even constitutional Supreme Court decisions that come down that give us the ability to do certain things that we do. We don't, as you know, make the law, but we have to enforce the law. We don't set the punishment in court. That's up to in our case, it's the Commonwealth attorneys and the judges to put that, or the jury. But I think when it comes to setting policy, and it's important, number one, to compare best practices and reach out to other organizations, other police departments that have the staff and have the expertise in their organization to develop good policies, and to reach out to attorneys that are familiar with the type of things that law enforcement deals with, so that you write the best policy that you can. Having policies open to the public, I think, is important. I think the policies that we have, people should know, what is our pursuit policy? What is our use of force policy? You might not necessarily care what our uniform is supposed to look like, but the ones that involve the people and the boots on the ground, where we're interacting every day, and at times are challenged because of those critical situations. I think having the Citizens Advisory Board is a good thing. I think sitting at the table with community members, not only to hear, again, just like I just said, that we want to know, what do you want from your police department? What can we give you that is what you're looking for? At the end of the day, we work for the community. And I think it's important for us, though, to be able to tell you what our challenges are. What is it like to be in that stressful situation when your equipment in the escalation of force isn't working, and if you have to resort to deadly force? No officer ever goes to work thinking that's where they're going to end that day. But I think as we develop the policies, our expertise has to count for something, and what we see and the training we get, and the professional organizations that we're members of, where we have the think tanks of the folks that have been there, done the research, and have it available for us. But at the same time, everybody comes from a different walk of life in your community, and I think it's important for them to be able to see the inner workings of what happens in their law enforcement agency. So for that, I think a Citizens Advisory Board is necessary, especially today, because there should be transparency in their law enforcement. Nothing should be done in a vacuum of how we do things. I'm even working with other Northern Virginia police departments, and we're creating a critical response team, which, when it comes to an officer-involved shooting, the agency's not investigating the shooting themselves. They have detectives from other agencies coming in. So you get a broader, less biased position, and you get experience coming at a different angle. So we feel that gives the public a little bit more comfort, we would hope, to show that we're not investigating our own. Granted, it is other law enforcement investigating other law enforcement, but you also have the expertise of homicide detectives that have done this for a while and have gotten all the training. And it doesn't necessarily mean there can't be an oversight of that team as well, and that might develop over time. But we're working on that just to be able to say it's not just us investigating us. Because I think that even if it is a clear and fair investigation and thorough, it gives a perception that perhaps maybe it's not. And getting rid of perceptions and explaining to people how it really is, I think, is the way to go.
And I think also, just to follow up a little bit of, what's kind of been talked about lately is how oftentimes police are perceived as having the responsibility for any kind of bad thing happening or any kind of challenge that's out there. And so we call police, but you're really, your focus is a little bit narrower than sometimes, gets perceived. So how can there be feedback about, who might be better to be there, a social worker or the like, and to see, what kind of feedback that the whole community could receive from that.
Yeah, and I think Phyllis can surely talk about this, but it just makes sense, right? When we started allowing people to come out of mental facilities and come on and take their medication, and I've talked to many people that have some type of mental illness, and the medication helps, but there's also side effects. So they go off those medications, and then problems start. And I mean, you look at the jails, and the amount of mental health inside the jails is so sad. But it makes sense by $1, is that we're boots on the ground 24/7. We'll train the police officers how to do it, right? But it doesn't make sense because it doesn't work. We're not trained in it. In 1982, when I came on law enforcement, I did police work. But as the years crept in, we started getting burdened with these other tasks that really should fall in another government department somewhere. But I don't think the answer is putting social workers out there, because some of these situations are violent. But do you pair them up? And then do governments want to pay to have social workers 24/7 alongside with officers? What do you give them to do? And do you get that type of person in that profession that wants to work the 24/7? I don't know, but I definitely think it's something that we need to explore. And there are some departments that have had that model. And I've reached out to a couple of them to see how it works. And granted, I'm a small department. We don't have other departments that can come in and help, but Loudoun County does have those. And I'm going to toss it to Phyllis because this is right down her alley of expertise.
So there's so much that I would respond to. First of all, I would question whether 99% of police officers that wake up in the morning and want to do what I think the vast majority does. I don't know if it is as high as 99%. I would also say that, you talked about the Constitution. The crux of this conversation is in many ways when people of color, African Americans, say the system doesn't work for us, my response is always, the system works for many African Americans exactly as it was designed to work, because it was designed to not work for us. When the Constitution was written, we were not human beings in the Constitution. And so if you think about it, the system hasn't worked for us in any place, in education, in law enforcement, in housing, just in general. And so when we talk about the policing, I really do not, I don't know where the term defund the police came from. I wish I'd never heard it, and I don't know any serious person who wants to defund the police. I do think we should reimagine what policing is, because right now, what we have is not working. And in fact, it's not working for law enforcement themselves. When you look at the domestic violence numbers in law enforcement compared to other professions, when you look at the suicide numbers in law enforcement compared to other professions, clearly it's not working for the community, and it's not working for law enforcement. So when we talk about what it means to back the blue or to support law enforcement, I think of all those things, like what is their mental health? What's happening in their homes? And it's not going well because although you train to do one thing, we don't train to do other things. We don't train to have them ask for help. We don't let them know that it's okay to step away sometime and to take some time down and to take some time away. And when they're not trained when they're not taught that they don't have to be all things to everybody all the time, then you get some situations that come up and that look very violent. And so when you do the investigation, you're investigating the moment, the incident, but you're not talking about all that came before that moment and what is the culture of law enforcement in general, that they cannot even ask for help when they need it from people who care about them. And that's actually very, very true. I don't believe law enforcement, one department, should ever investigate themselves, not because they will try to do anything that they shouldn't do or try to not have an honest investigation, but because when you're investigating your friend, when you're investigating the guy that you had a beer with last week and you were there at his child's christening, you're not going to be able to be completely objective. You're just not. We're human beings. We're just not. And so it is ridiculous to think that one department can investigate themselves. When you think about it, the military has civilian oversight for a reason. Right? There's no law enforcement, military, paramilitary organization should ever not have civilian oversight. So as we wrap it back around to the civilian review boards, well, first of all, you are correct that for any of these boards to work, you have to respect the training of the law enforcement. I would also say that anyone who sits on one of these boards shouldn't just be some Jane or Joe person who means well but doesn't know anything at all about what it means to even be around law enforcement. There should be people on that board that understand the laws, that understand the structure of law enforcement, that understand the struggles of law enforcement. It should be all those things on the civilian review board, but there should absolutely be a civilian review board. And when you want to look at one model where it's been done pretty well, you not have to look much farther than Prince William County. I am a trained and badged HIDA therapist. HIDA is an acronym for High Intensity Drug Trafficking Area. It's a federal program that has a prevention component. I am a prevention therapist in HIDA, which meant that we often went in when the police were called to situations, especially involving our clients. We literally were located, had a desk in the police station. And so when someone was called and we knew that it was one of our clients or one of our clients' families, we went with them all the time. Now, they went first and they assessed the situation and they made sure things were safe, but that did not mean that we didn't go in and talk to the person and were able to talk to them. I worked in a jail for many, many years. I cannot tell you how many times a jail officer has come over to get me and said, Miss Randall, or at the time I didn't go by Randall, but we have this inmate who's in our custody, and this is what we're seeing. Can you come with us? And I would join them and talk to that inmate. So it's happening already, and it's just a matter of law enforcement knowing that for them to get better, it might mean that they need someone else to help them. And it's not an accusation that they're doing anything wrong, but it is a realization that they're human beings, that they are human beings. Finally, I would say that what we know about law enforcement, what we know about education, what we know about housing, what we know about employment, is that people do look at African Americans and people of color differently. You know, there are so many studies to show that when someone of color has an interaction with a police officer or a law enforcement officer, it is more likely to be a negative interaction, even when that person is doing exactly what they're supposed to do, even when that person has their hands up, even when that person is on the ground laying down. It's a different response. And so that goes back to who are you hiring and what is the training and what's happening. And we absolutely cannot have these conversations if we don't expose those things and rip that Band-Aid off and say there is an issue. And the question is not the stats show there is an issue, the numbers show there's an issue, my common sense shows there's an issue. That's okay to say that, but then the next question is, now what do we do? Now what do we do? And what we do is exactly what we're doing right now, having these conversations, these courageous, critical conversations. That's a word, I like that word, conversations, and do it in a very kind of forthright, honest way that's not accusatory but looks for solutions.
I don't want to get in the way here of the conversation going on. I don't know if we would have a little back and forth about that. That'd be great.
I have to agree with everything she says, because I think the people that are hired are notoriously good people. But what is happening, and I'm so glad that she touched on the suicide, the domestic violence that happens in law enforcement families. More officers die of suicide than are killed at the hands of an assailant every single year. So what is going on? What burden are we putting on these people that come in? If you ever went to a academy graduation and you have 21, 23-year-olds and they walk across the stage proud as can be, and sometimes their parent pins their badge on if they're in law enforcement or a relative, and it's the proudest moment, they're the most fit, they're going to go out there and save the world. But you look at them 8 years later and things start to fall apart. What is it? I mean, I think some of it is the shift work. Some of it is the things that they have to see and the things that they have to deal with, and, you know, the death notifications they give, and the horrible part of the job. But it's part of the job. It just is what it is, and it eats at you over and over. And if we don't give them mechanisms, number one, ways to maybe not give all that to them. I mean, they start out at 21 years old, most of them, and then we're giving them these duties that someone 50 years old would never want to do because it's so awful. But so we have to make sure, number one, that we hire the right people, we give them the tools to stay strong, both mentally, spiritually, and emotionally, physically. And I think a lot of times we don't, because we end up shorthanded. We overwork them. We work them shifts back to back. We make them, you know, work midnights, then go to court, transport a mental consumer down to Southern Virginia, and then they're driving back with little sleep. We really put them in bad situations. And the thing is most departments hire people that never will say no, never will say I've had enough, will never cry. So we're humans.
Well,
as
they
Phyllis
cry.
said.
They cry. They just don't cry in public.
Not
They
in
cry.
public, not in public.
They cry.
And it's a shield that they put up, and just a facade that they put up that isn't really who we are.
Yeah.
But we stand strong for the community, but in the background, you know, there's a lot more that needs to happen.
And so when we have I think the term Blue Lives Matter is kind of, it's not a term that I would use, because when we say Black Lives Matter, it speaks to what you can see. There's no blue people, right? So, but what I would say is law enforcement matters. But when I say that, I mean in the full spectrum. I mean, I want them to have the support. I want them to have the freedom to say, gosh, I'm not doing okay today, right? I went to a scene where a child was hurt and a woman died, and I need some time off. If we don't give them that freedom, it's going to bleed out someplace else. People cannot have that kind of emotional impact, that kind of emotional trauma, and not have it come out somewhere. It's going to come out, and more often than not, it comes out one of two places. One, in their families, which is why their domestic violence rate is higher, or two, in the streets, right? And so it comes out one of those two places. And so when I say reimagine law enforcement, that is what I mean. Reimagine how we treat them. Reimagine, do they have any required mental health days? Yeah, you feel good, you feel fine. You got to take some days off anyway. You just have to. Yeah, you had a really hard call last night where something terrible happened. You're going to go see a therapist whether you want to or not. That is part of reimagining law enforcement. And so, these camps get built of, you're going to be on this side or this side, when the truth is, if we reimagine law enforcement, we take better care of our law enforcement will do a better job taking care of the community. It just has to happen. It just will. At the same time, we still cannot ignore that law enforcement has different interactions with people of color than they do with people not of color. Tamir Rice was 12 years old. He had a play gun, a toy gun. When the police called and said, there's a kid outside with a gun, I think he's playing, I'm pretty sure that gun's a toy gun. That's what they were told. They drove up, and within 5 seconds of getting out the car, the law enforcement officer shot 12-year-old Tamir Rice to death, where you see other cases where the young white kids are walking around with semi-automatic weapons right by police officers, and nothing happens to them. And so it is twofold. It's reimagining and better taking care of our law enforcement and allowing them to be vulnerable and to be human and to not have to be strong or seeing what strength is in different ways, but also at the same time acknowledging that the interaction they have with our communities, Black and brown communities, does look different. And so both of those things have to work in tandem. And it's really important that neither side is defensive and neither side is throwing accusations. Both sides come to the table with a willingness to talk. And I think often when we have these conversations, people come in and they're in two camps. And if you're wrong, then I'm right. And if I'm right, then you're wrong. And that's it. And it's never that. It's always, we're talking about human beings. And so human beings have, you know, we're onions, as Shrek says. I can't believe I'm quoting, Shrek, or I'm quoting Donkey, one of them. But there's layers to us. It's not one thing or the other. There are layers. Many law enforcement officers, after they have a negative interaction with a person of color, they're shocked themselves. They're like, what was that? Why did I respond like that? Why did I do that? It's not who they believe themselves to be. And in many ways, it's not who they are. But in that moment, it's how they reacted. Well, why? What is their unconscious bias? What does lie below that? What experiences did they have? And so all those things have to be discussed. But I really think the discussion starts with, how do we better take care of our law enforcement? How do we reimagine law enforcement? And then it has to grow from there, because I think if we don't do that first, it just does not get better. And that, by the way, that goes for all first responders, to be honest.
Right. And I think it's important for the races to mix and to talk and to be, you know, trying to hire minorities is tough.
Yeah.
You know, you look at the communities and what does it look like? You know, and if we went that far, you know, most, I think the United States, 51% women. Well, you don't have 51% women in the workforce. Yeah. But yet, having that, and they say 30% is kind of the magic number of having them at the decision-making tables to make a difference. Well, how do you have the diversity of your workforce? Where do you go find those folks? Yeah. And I do worry a bit about...
And what does that look like? Because I've talked to so many officers, African-American officers, and if you talk to members of Noble, you'll hear this also, that when African Americans go into the law enforcement, they have a hard time. They hear things from their peers, that they hear racially tinged comments or jokes from their peers that makes them concerned and worried about their own selves and what that will look like when they get out in the streets. And so it's not just hiring people of color and women and diverse populations, is also how does that look inside the department itself?
How do you support them inside and make sure? And I think I can feel that a little bit by being, you know, a minority my whole career in law enforcement. So I get it a bit, but I'm sure it's a bit different, because I think too, they also have to go back into their communities. That's and right. Do they get ribbed and do they get ridiculed for being law enforcement in their communities? Yeah. I think some probably do. So I think that's kind of on both sides of the fence for them. But I don't think you can be a well-rounded law enforcement agency if you do not have diversity within your department. And I think striving to do that, and again, another reason to get to the table with your community is to actually have them help you recruit diversity so that you can have it and have a better understanding of everybody's walk of life.
Yeah. And have it in the upper echelons of the department.
Right.
Yeah.
I'm going to intervene here just because I'm looking at my clock and I'm past my time, but that's all right. I'm really delighted to have both of you. The other question I was going to ask, and I'll just leave it as an open thing to consider, is, you know, I'm really glad to be here to help you to have this conversation in front of all the rest of us, because I think that is a way as a church we could, in some sense, participate in working towards a better kind of way of our life being together. I do wonder if, you know, there's other things that we as a congregation might do to be of help so that we're not just the consumers of you know, political leadership and police law enforcement, but that we're a part of that, and that's one of the things I don't think we'll get to today. I did know that when I talked to Chief McAlister earlier, she said she would be glad if the congregation could ask questions. And I'm going to ask if people have questions that maybe they type them into the Facebook Live, and then after this is over, if the two of you want to field questions, we can just maybe have a little bit longer conversation about that.
Can I just answer
Sure.
that question really quick?
Sure.
I will say this. I am a person of faith. I am a Christian. I was saved when I was 19 years old. And we can talk about other things, but if there's one thing, and I can't speak for Chief McAlister, but if it's one thing I would ask myself all the time is prayer. And I would say, and I always say, I want you to pray my wisdom, my strength, my patience, and whatever else you want to pray for me. I appreciate the prayer of the righteous, and I think it matters.
I agree.
Thank you so much. Well, we are really delighted to have you here, and we feel a blessing to have you have your leadership actually in our communities, and also for you to be vulnerable in sharing those things, bringing all your intelligences about what so many things happen. Bonnie, you have a hand up here just to.
I just have a comment for both of you and Dave, that many people are writing in and saying thank you for having this conversation, and thank you, David, for arranging it. But everyone just is really appreciating the conversation that you are having with us. And I do know that I'm sure people will send questions, but I think most of it is just great.
So what's being articulated in the back is that that people are sending in their thanksgiving for witnessing this conversation that's taking place and appreciating that. And we do really appreciate it. I'm going to